All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. This is the weekly Hangops. We've got a couple of people joining us. I think my thought process was to talk deployment strategies and application deployment and all that stuff because I feel like it's come up a lot recently as far as things like I'm trying to think of the term, like as we talk a lot about microservices and talk about Docker and all of this fun stuff, the ideas around application deployment are really changing. So um, I guess the starting point is what are you guys doing to deploy your apps, and how often are you deploying your apps?
Mhm. Hey.
There you go. Well, you were unmuted. Go for it, man.
Or actually, at this particular moment, I'm not deploying any apps, but what I typically would use is Capistrano. Um,
Okay. So then Rails, Sinatra-y things?
yeah, exactly. Also, if there was like a new project, I'd probably kind of whip that out as a first kind of instinct to use just a simple way to deploy stuff. Do you
Hmm.
have any other recommendations and stuff to use? I know some people are in the camp of wanting to use Chef as to manage the whole deployment process. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so I think that that's kind of an interesting place, right? Like, at a very basic level, I like the primitives that Chef gives you from the ability to just use the revision resource, but that has its own set of problems. I think at this point in my life, I guess it depends on the app. Like the starter of just getting something up onto staging using the revision resource makes a lot of sense to me.
Mhm.
Um, but on the other hand, when I'm running something larger in production, I tend to be one that prefers something more along the lines of, Jenkins builds an artifact and then you deploy that artifact, even if what that artifact is um, and is just bundling all the gems together and doing all that stuff ahead of time, and then pushing that up to the server.
Okay.
So because you end up in that state where it's easier for things to be out of sync. Like when I did, truth be told, the last time I was managed any sort of large production environment, it was all PHP and Puppet. And even then, like you're not compiling things, but it always made a lot of sense to build a tarball of what you actually wanted on the server and to clean up the Git references and to clean up all that stuff and push that out.
Okay.
So yeah, it's an interesting world, especially with things like Docker, and we're talking a lot about immutable infrastructure. And like, if you're Netflix, you're deploying the entire box the uh, as your deployable artifact. So it's a different world, right? At
Yeah.
that point,
Yeah, it's more like an immutable appliance almost that you're building the whole machine as a VM appliance and version that.
I still think it has a lot of downsides to it in the sense of like, well, there's implicit things there that no one talks about, right? Like it implicitly assumes that when you're deploying that way, that everything is stateless, that you can just lose things. And that's great for the web front end, but that's not great if you're running a memcache instance or, memcache is probably a bad example, but like a Redis instance or an actual database like Postgres or MySQL type thing.
Right, right.
So
Yeah, it really depends on the state tolerance of that particular service component, I guess.
um, Sorry, like too many notification noises. How like I've met people that can actually like pay attention to like 10 different things at once, but it's never something I've been
Mhm.
able um, to do myself. Hoping we get a few more people to join in with us, just to kind of hear what other people are doing, because like we've heard a lot of things about microservices and Docker and all the things, if you will, and it just it's interesting to, or for me, it's been an interesting thought process of wondering who's actually doing what. Is that actually what your deployment process looks like? Because I imagine in a Docker world, your deployable artifact Docker uh, is a Docker container.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely curious how people are doing Docker in production and how they're how they're dealing with the problem of spanning hosts and like kind of organizing their systems architecture to kind of accommodate that.
I lost the window I was looking for. There we go. That's actually wow. The in in IRC, someone just mentioned that idea of roll back and roll forward, and it's an interesting story. And okay, so yes, I get that there's no such thing as roll back. There is only roll forward, but there is something to be said for being able to update to roll forward to the last version.
Yeah.
Um, and just that idea of the number of times where it's like, okay, something got introduced here and we've been troubleshooting it for an hour. We should probably just go to the old version and get the site back up.
Yeah, exactly. And test it in isolation. That gets a little bit more tricky when you have database migrations included and things like that. But
Yeah, well, and even Etsy, I mean, they talk about how they treat database migrations differently, and same with Facebook. Like, database migration is a very, very different thing than um, just adding new code to the box.
yeah,
So it's and it's funny, even the database thing. Like, I had someone introduce some new database code that made a whole bunch of additional calls, and we ran into this place where it's like, oh, well, crap. The site's all of a sudden, it looks like we're getting DDoSed, but when we actually go look at the source of the traffic, it's all from the database backend. What happened there? And you find out really fast that someone wrote some new code that amplified the size of a query that happened all the freaking time, and now the site was slow because we were returning too much data to the site, type thing.
yeah, yeah. I guess you could account for, or you could probably reproduce that by replaying some little slice of organic traffic that normally hits your front end onto your staging environment or something, and kind of seeing what the impact is. You could probably
Exactly.
implement that.
But I mean, I guess, and that's actually, it's interesting when we talk application deployment, like that idea of, I think for a lot of us in the web ops space, the idea of releases being something that you wait until the weekend for, or that you wait until after hours and all that crap for, um, it just seems odd, I think, to a lot of us. And it's interesting just to think about the number of people that are in that situation of no, they have to wait until Friday at 5 to release code because of the business rules associated with it. and or those that are on like 6 month release cycles where they can't make an update for 6 months. Like, oh my God, I don't even know that I don't know that I could live in that environment of 6 month release cycles.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like an environment where there's kind of a lot of uh, unknown factors and kind of fear involved with the process that you're not really sure what's going to happen, and because of that, you need to do it in the weekend. And I think it really should be something that you know exactly what's going to happen, and you could do it with courage any time of day, and just press a button, and you'll know exactly what the result is going to be because it's been fully tested, or you're deploying every hour or something like that. But if you wait so long, then there's so many moving bits in that bag, and it's going to be hard to predict what happens if you don't replay it on your staging environment first or something.
Exactly, and I don't even know that. What is it called? Like, I don't even know that. I forgot what I was going to say. That's nothing new, though.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got 12 people out there watching. You guys should come talk with us, because
Yeah, I was just going to actually just lurk in the background. I wasn't really planning on contributing, but yeah, I definitely would like to hear other people's point of view as well.
the funny thing is I can talk about this stuff for hours, but it's not fun if there aren't other folks out there to kind of jump in with us and,
Mm-hmm.
discuss. So yeah, deployable artifacts are a thing. The interesting aspect of this whole thing is we talk a lot about application deployment. I think by nature of the jobs that a lot of us are doing, like we're working in environments where that actually is a thing. But like, how about things like, I don't know, deploying your LDAP server?
Oh yeah,
Woo! Other people to talk with us.
nice.
Welcome.
All right, I'll hop in and see if I know anybody with my words. But yeah, deployment, it's interesting, isn't it? Definitely, I have a PR open against. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I mean, and
Oh man.
the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that none of us are experts on this. So like throwing out questions is also useful, because I think we all have opinions, but it's not an exact science, and your environment dictates a lot about what makes sense from a deployment perspective. So, Donald, what type of application are you deploying at this point?
So I work for a company called CrowdTap, and our architecture is basically a bunch of sort of Rails microservices loosely coupled with a pub-sub framework that we wrote called Promiscuous. So it kind of is an interesting thing because there's sort of a shared schema, and then mostly things kind of can go out independently, and we kind of run currently on a sort of continuous deployment basis, but it's been driven by sort of, we have images that get updated occasionally, and then there's also sort of a Capistrano stack on top of it that kind of adds the last mile code part, as it were.
That makes sense. And like, and it's interesting that even that separation, like, right, like that deployment of the software versus the deployment of the box.
Yeah, I mean, I have some work I did yesterday that's an outstanding PR that I'm debating with the other ops person here. Was basically we're reconfiguring some of our chef stuff to get the configuration running more as actual management rather than just sort of as a provisioning system.
Okay, that makes sense.
So I've been pro the idea of using, for example, the deploy revision WLRP, but he is less so. And so we're still using this Capistrano setup, and the real question was like, do we want it to be the case that when the services start, they start with the code that's on the box, or is it reasonable for it to trigger a deployment? In sort of your immutable infrastructure world, you kind of think that the box should be coming up. We also autoscale, I guess, is relevant to say. And like, if the box is coming up, you want it to be running the latest code pretty much always, but there's always going to maybe be exceptions, and that's an interesting thing to worry about.
Well, and I mean, there's an interesting thing there. So, right, you can go a couple of directions with that. First off, you can use the deploy revision to actually manage that entire thing. And maybe what the answer is, instead of deploying a revision, you just, I want to say there's a Git resource, and just pull down Git on your initial build out. One of the other things we've talked about doing from like an autoscale perspective, if when the node comes up, it doesn't necessarily already have the code on it, is having it go pull the artifact down from somewhere else, like as part of it, and that's actually not a horrible idea, especially with something like Chef, where you have the ability to do the string manipulation after the fact. Like you could use a remote file to pull the tarball down off GitHub, and then untar that tarball so that you're getting the latest as part of your build out.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch like the Berkshelf Way talk that Jamie Windsor gave at ChefConf, right, with his whole sort of Berkshlow thing that he's doing over at Undead Labs, what he sort of has it showing, right, is his chef recipe is responsible for going and looking at the releases on the GitHub repo and sort of pulling the code tarball and the cookbooks tarball and then running the chef's client. And he sort of does all of his environment management, as far as I can tell, through just like the chef environments and doing sort of the locking of the cookbook versions and doing Simber and like the environment cookbook pattern specifying that you sort of make sure that the application is getting updated based on the version that you locked from the cookbooks, but that sort of assumes that you're having cut releases, which like is an interesting argument. Like certainly the argument here is that the claim is that it'll slow down the developers if they have to worry about an idea of a release being cut.
Well, okay, so you've got a couple things there, right? Like, so let's talk just for a second why the big argument I've seen against using the deploy revision is you are essentially, like, you can end up with your box.
Bay or no? Bay or no?
Like, I think you're talking about, yeah, sorry guys. So, like, I think what you're dealing with there is the situation where you can end up with your boxes out of sync because Chef only runs every 30 minutes. You end up pulling down. Now, what I see happen a lot in our environment, so Supermarket actually uses the deploy revision, and what we do each time is we specify a revision for prod, and by specifying the revision for prod versus staging ends up being this place where we're set to master, it will just bump, and there's only one box involved. So, like, you only end up in a situation where one there's not the ability for things to get out of sync. Whereas if you've got 4 boxes running in prod, if you're not deploying from a particular revision, so we just specify the revision in the data bag, and you end up having to coordinate that. So we just do a knife SSH roll prod, boom, it's all done. But those are things to think about. Like, how do you keep all 4 of those nodes in sync? Do you lock that stack and CCR one at a time? CCR being Chef client run. The thing that Capistrano gives you, which is kind of nice, is it does give you that ability to, as part of the Capistrano script, to, okay, stop the or pull this out of the load balancer, wait for the connections to die off, now deploy the new code, now restart Unicorn. Now that we've verified that the Unicorn workers are actually responding, start back up or add it back to the load balancer type thing. Those are just things to think about. I mean, I don't think that there are good answers to any of them, to be frank. So, what else, guys? Or folks, I guess. Anyone?
Did I miss us talking about Canary deployments? Because I'm interested in hearing about how people test for whether or not a server is, ready for traffic.
So we haven't talked about Canary deployments. For those that aren't familiar with them, you want to explain the concept?
Sure. Well, per my understanding, Canary deployment to me is basically kind of a smoke test. Smoke test, maybe I should start with smoke test. It might be a good analogy. So the classic smoke test is turning on a server back in the day or any kind of appliance and making sure that smoke doesn't come pouring out of it. So the same thing sort of applies to Canary. The canary in the coal mine basically being, if the canary is alive, things are good. If the canary dies, everybody, abandons ship. So in the sense of server deployment and provisioning, Canary Test would be that you provision a new server and you validate that that server is properly configured. Everything is running as expected. You don't have any sort of abnormal load on the server in that all of your provisioning is complete and it's actually ready to be live. And that's something that I think is important when you're dealing with auto-scaling, taking machines out of a load balancer to be provisioned, or spinning up new servers and waiting for them to be ready for traffic. So I think, I've done this locally and remotely with things like server spec, and even with Ansible. Ansible's got pretty good ways of testing over SSH. And you can write your own. You can use Selenium if you wanted to actually hit your critical path on your web app. So I'm just curious. Like I've done all of those things in the past to varying degrees, depending on the size and scope of the project. And I'm curious to hear what everybody else does on a regular basis. If there's something super simple that's everybody's go-to, or if there's anything new that I may not have heard of.
Well, so hopefully someone's got better answers than I do, because like the initial smoke test for me has always been, okay, I just hit the deploy, Alt-Tab to Chrome and hit refresh. Okay, it works.
Sometimes that's all you have time to do,
But so it's interesting as you bring up Canary, because I've actually, when I was thinking Canary, I've heard a lot of okay, you've got a fleet of 1,000 systems, so let's bring up 100 systems or 10 systems and shunt some small amount of traffic off to those systems to see if they can actually handle the load, if they actually do the respond thing, do our 500s increase, that type of thing. And that's something I've spent a lot of time kind of pondering, like how would you actually do that, especially if you're not on AWS, where, and even AWS makes things complicated depending on where you are and what you're doing, yada, yada, yada. But that idea of
partition traffic, basically, or
exactly.
ramping up servers, which is something I think we all sort of heard about from Facebook first. Back a couple of years back when they talked about how they could spin up 10% of their user base on a new version of their site, which is a really interesting use case. Or the same sort of thing. Or you're spinning up your new version of your software internally only, and it's accessible on dev dot whatever, and then you switch it over once you've proven that you can throw a certain amount of traffic on it, whether it's bees or whatnot.
So one of the ways we did this from actually the shunting of traffic, just because it's kind of an interesting hack. But so at a previous company, what we did is the CDN we were using as part of its processing would do, I think they called it a dice roll. So basically, some percentage of the time you would end up in what we call the test pool, and there were 4 test pools or 10 test pools, whatever it happened to be, and you would then end up with a cookie set, and Apache would then, based on that cookie being set, would check to see if the doc root for that test pool existed, and if it existed, it would serve that PHP code instead of the other PHP code. It worked really well, but and as long as you still had that cookie set, you always ended up on the right site. The problem is if you flushed cookies, you might go to effectively a different site because you were no longer being tested. So that's kind of just as a note on the partitioning of traffic, crazy things you can do. But I don't know. I've always kind of the Canary aspect of it, the shunting of traffic. It seems like such a great idea, except unless you're at scale, it becomes very difficult to do. I think unless you're doing something like I was just talking about, where the CDN sets a cookie, and I guess you could do that with Apache, right? If there's no cookie here, set one, and the next time you visit any of the 4 web servers or whatever, you end up in the right place.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of things, it's everybody wants it in an ideal setting when you have unlimited time and unlimited resources, but a lot of us work on projects where people won't notice if it's 5 minutes between a deploy and putting your code live, because you can let it run internally for a day or two and nobody's snapping at your heels. So it's definitely for the Facebooks of the world, I think. But it's starting to become cheaper to do those sort of things. So I think we may see some tooling that makes it a little bit easier going forward. Things where we're looking at containerization will assist things like that, where you can really cheaply spin up a new version of your code without having to worry about the overhead of spinning up entire VMs in different regions and whatnot. So yeah, it definitely depends on resources and time, absolutely, and use case for sure.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. So someone's pointing out we're almost talking about 2 different things here, because we're talking about Canary builds, but a lot of what we're talking about has implications as feature flag stuff, and that's the end game, right? At the end of the day, anything that we are doing in this realm, you have to look at what you're doing and why you're doing it. If what you're trying to achieve is when I make this change, does it fall over under load? Well, that's different than is this feature usable, and getting A/B testing type things, and all of those things. You work together to build the same thing, but so perfect example. Let's take the example I was giving. If you're doing your load testing using that just different doc root process, it's entirely possible that if the Canary problem is a load one where, yes, 10% of your traffic just took out 100% of your traffic because you did something stupid in code, that's a thing.
Right.
And you have to know what your goals are and what you're actually testing. And because it's so funny, like how often do we say, "Oh, I want to do this thing," and come to find out that that's not actually what we're testing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the feature flag thing is a little bit different because feature flags don't tend to affect the load balancing layer. So feature flagging code, you'd have to build some kind of integration where you're actually routing 10% of your traffic before they even see the feature flag, right? They have to hit the server to get the code that's going to have whatever feature flag. Mm-hmm. So largely shunting traffic, partitioning traffic, that has to do with a load balancer configuration more so than feature flags in code. Unless you have feature flags on your load balancer, in which case you're golden.
Yeah, well, and that's entirely possible, right? Like, you could totally do that. It's just I think it's a hard space because I think there's a lot of we're seeing some really cool examples of people doing this at scale, but how do you do this at small scale if your entire site will run on an M3 extra large? Like, if that's enough to support your production traffic, do you break down to smaller boxes so that you can do this, so you can like shunt traffic? But at that point, if you don't have that much traffic, are you actually going to see a problem that wouldn't have, that exists because you don't have the scale to introduce the problem? If what I'm saying makes sense to anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'd have to be synthetically generating traffic, right? And that's not a perfect case. There are cases where there's many cases where it's just like testing. You could be testing the wrong thing. You could be using the wrong load generation mechanism that's not going to trigger the problem because it's artificial, right? And it's not following any sort of like human pattern, or you're missing an edge case in your virtual human load testing.
Exactly. And Dave, you seem like you've wanted to jump into...
Sure. Yeah, so I guess let's go back to... I can just explain how... So I used to work at Pinterest, and I built the deploy system. So I can talk about how we did our canaries if people are interested.
That's awesome.
Yep.
So we used mutable servers because we just weren't that good at getting stuff to be in an immutable state, and we knew the amount of time it would take us to get to both an immutable state and to try to deploy immutable artifacts. It just wasn't in our DNA. So we were like, we're going to have mutable servers. What we did for Canary stuff is we just said, hey, you know what? We're going to designate this node, mark it in. We use Zookeeper to do a lot of deployment orchestration. We said, hey, this node will be a Canary node. If that didn't work out for some reason, we could switch it using a config thing in our deploy tool. And on our varnish layer, we would say, hey, a percentage of traffic is going to go here. And it's, if let's say we had 100 servers, we would just say, okay, one out of those 100 servers is the Canary, just send traffic there. We evolved the system enough to where each node would just say, hey, I'm version A, and I'm version B, and I'm version C, and by the way, C is the Canary. And so that varnish itself could say, hey, this one person, we're going to make them go into the Canary group, and then they're going to validate stuff. We wouldn't Canary for too long. We would Canary for maybe an hour at the most. And for the web traffic, it was usually just the... We ended up hiring just a release engineer just to release the web stuff. Other services just kind of did it by team by team. That person would... So our deploy tool would automatically run a bunch of Selenium tests against Canary and just say, hey, yeah, you know what, end-to-end tests seem to look good. that actually ended up catching a lot of errors and stuff, so it wasn't just a nice academic exercise. Then the Canary node itself, we would ask engineers that had committed code to say, hey, validate your changes, because these are going to go live soon. And then we would have the release engineer also do a bunch of like manual scripts as well as like monitoring that node compared to a control box, which was basically just like another special node. And we did catch a lot of issues. We catch things where like CPU would spike up, and we were like, okay, we got to roll this back. We would do some Git bisections and try to figure out where in the process this all failed, and then just eventually get back to normal again. So that was basically how we dealt with canaries.
That's way neat, and it's funny. Like even there are points that you hit that I thought were kind of interesting with as far as like the Git bisection. Like, okay, what code actually caused this? And that idea of we've had a lot of discussions, and I would be interested in your opinion on if, like, any time that a commit gets merged into master, that basically becomes a version, or like a feature gets merged, or what, a set of commits, if you will. So it's part of one feature branch or whatever you want to call it, gets merged into master, and it goes out, versus having a couple features go out at the same time. Any thoughts on that versus, or were you guys doing that and it just didn't sound that way, or?
What do you mean by goes out?
Like actually released a prod, like so.
Oh, okay. No, we did twice. Well, it depends on the service. So on the web service, we did like twice a day, and the reason for that was, well, I mean, one, I personally believe in continuous delivery over continuous deployment, and we can get into the nuances about that. But two, there are changes. A real simple example is like, you look at Pinterest version 1, and then you're looking at Pinterest version 2.
Mm-hmm.
The assets and stuff that are called, and then the Ajax things that like trigger events and stuff, they're going to be different. And unless you're going to run all those versions, you're going to create an experience for people who are pinning that is not necessarily what they expect, because somebody might go out and change like the backend Ajax call. And so we always try to steer people to be on the same version for as long as possible. And we just settled with like twice a day deployments, just because there was such a manual step in there already, and we just wanted to eliminate how jarring it was for people.
Mm-hmm.
For other services, much smaller services like the spam and abuse teams had lots of tools that would just deploy automatically. They would go into Jenkins. Jenkins would make a build. That build would be version based on the Git SHA, and then they would either deploy it manually, or they would just say, you know what, just deploy each one, and we'll just catch it if there's a problem.
That makes sense. And I hadn't thought about that from the regard of the end user experience, because that does make a huge difference as well. If you're changing even small things all the time, that would be annoying as crap. Be like, what? Why did this just change?
Yeah.
I do have a question. I came in the middle. Do you know if there's any tools that monitor the code paths getting hit on a deployment, so you can see on software getting run, this function's getting called, that sort of stuff, of maybe percentages, or finding features or code that isn't getting hit at all and maybe is spot for removal? Or
New Relic seems to do that, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, you could probably, at least the first part of your question, the what code paths are getting hit, well, yeah, you basically would, with New Relic deployed, you can go in and like select the space after it. And then the other, I think App Dynamics might be a way to do that. Because really the harder part, right, is that a lot of these, you have to have something that's doing dynamic instrumentation of the code. It can't just be that you put a probe in there. What is the one? Let me go find a sysadvent from last year, because I know someone talked about this.
Depending on your specific goal, too, like, I was always curious about that, but New Relic was too expensive. So if you know, like, hey, there's this code path and I think no one's using it, statsd is super simple to like just say, oh, let's just add this counter, and if the counter doesn't go up for a week, then we can just take out this code path entirely. I mean, whatever your business case is, you'll have to work around it. And then likewise, if you have code paths that are maybe expensive and stuff, and you want to measure it, like statsd is perfect because you can just be like, okay, yeah, just increment the counter every time somebody hits this, and if we have a new release and it's totally jacking up this endpoint or this code path, and it's a bad idea, like then you can like revisit that code and just say, okay, well maybe we need to cache around it or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, that like from that regards, that's absolutely the simplest thing to do. Is if you've got statsd with graphite set up, just toss something in to make note, and that it's not what I see a lot of actually is where you do the timings where you start and end on at the beginning and end of a function or a method call just to get a feel for what's going on. And with that said, there was another company that was doing stuff that was really neat, and I just haven't. I'm like, I don't click fast enough through the sysadvent blog. Where is it?
Actually, I found a couple of new ones when I was at DevOps Days Boston, and they totally slipped my mind. But there's a lot of like real user monitoring going on right now outside of New Relic. I'll try and dig up some links and post them in.
Okay, so I found it. The company is Appneta.
Yes.
And in fact, I remember demoing this, and at the time I was like, oh my god, this is going to overwhelm the developers because this is so fucking awesome. And like, there's just so much information. Like, you hit information overload really fast. But yeah, way neat stuff. And as an aside to that, there's an open source tool that goes along with it for using with Twitter Zipkin. And yeah, take a look at that article I just posted, because that actually looks like the hotness. I should just mention Appneta on Twitter and see if someone magically shows up. But yeah, to get back to your question, I think the answer is take a look at New Relic, take a look at look at Appneta and Xtrace, and it looks like Twitter's Zipkin was mentioned in this article from sysadvent. Sadly, I've never been at a place where, how do I put this? Like, we were at a point where that was useful because we just weren't there yet. Like, there was so much other low-hanging fruit, but New Relic was just amazing when we ran it because you could actually go and you could watch the graphs and be like, oh shit, someone just ran a query on master or on the database master. How do you know? Well, watch that spike in how long it's taking to get back database traffic.
Mm-hmm. It's also really, when you look at what you get from New Relic, even at the highest tier, if you throw it on a single machine just to get a profile, so you've got 80 app servers, you only really need it on one if you're trying to do pretty basic stuff. And then if you want to actually see how that averages out, you could scale that up to maybe 5 machines, but you only really need a sampling, right? And the free version of New Relic is almost entirely full-featured. It's just 7 days retention. So you can get a lot from the free version too.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really interesting is it when you're talking about New Relic and when you're talking about a lot of those applications, it's important to know what you're looking for, right? Like, if real user management, so you're a media site, and the couple of seconds it takes for that, how long it takes for that page to load actually matters and impacts your bottom line, i.e. you're search driven and Google cares. It might make a lot of sense to do New Relic just so that you can actually figure out what the hell is taking so long for your page to load. If that doesn't matter to you, and you're a SaaS application, and you've got enough what's the word I'm looking for here? Like enough discussion coming in from the outside that Google isn't what's driving you. I always laugh because like I work at Chef, right? So Google just isn't a thing, right? Because you can't really Google Chef. Our marketing and ad folks, or our marketing folks, we don't actually have ad folks, but our marketing folks have to rely on something other than Google to send people to us. So as a result, are we actually optimizing for being crawled? I'm not going to spend the time to do it, that's for sure. We'll do some basic stuff, but like it really depends on your business model, and that's super, super important to discuss, because even at $250 a server, which I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but whatever. If you have a fair number of servers, like 10 or more, ask your New Relic folks for discounts, because they might be able to help you.
Yep.
Oh, and not just picking on New Relic, as a sysadmin, always ask for a discount. If you've got enterprise in your title, ask because you're an enterprise. If you're not an enterprise customer, ask because you're a small business, or ask because you're a startup. But always ask for a discount. In fact, I've actually had like Cisco reps tell me no one pays List. List is just there to make managers feel good that they're getting a discount, because no one actually pays $10,000 for that particular switch. They actually pay $7,000 because that's the normal thing.
That's why every enterprise website says call us for pricing, because it's all up in the air.
Well, and what kills me is and this is totally off the particular topic, but yay, sysadmins, oh my God, I want to know basic pricing, because I can make some general assumptions. If that box is a $100,000 box and I've got $5,000 to spend, I don't think I'm going to be getting that, M4000.
Right, and you don't want to wait 2 days for an email that tells you,
oh, no joke,
chain that it's $100,000.
Well, and it's funny, straight up, I'm trying to think of the name of the company. Who's the big cable distributor that everybody uses? Graybar. I absolutely stopped using Graybar because their prices weren't that much better. If they were better, it was by a couple of cents than Monoprice. And with Monoprice, I could go to the web interface, go click, 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 click. Okay.
Yeah.
It shows up the next day.
So the other case that I wanted to bring up, so aside from search traffic, if you're running Ecommerce, speed is also super important. All that study that Amazon did about cart abandonment, that's when you really want to know how long it takes for your critical path. So it's worth investing in, real user monitoring in that case as well.
Well, now what is interesting though is it depends though as to if you're an e-commerce platform and you're writing your e-commerce platform, okay, I'm sorry, if you're just throwing up a Magento instance and kind of customizing it, it probably makes sense to just use New Relic, because yeah, I'm willing to bet New Relic actually has even they've already got stuff for profiling Magento and all that good stuff. But if you are e-commerce and you wrote your own thing, it may make a lot of sense to write your own code to track different parts of it. That said, the RUM aspect of it is still the RUM stuff, that's big. But if you're just tracing your MySQL calls, I mean, use something like StatsD.
Yeah, StatsD is great for that. Especially if you don't know really what to measure yet. Just throwing that stuff in there and looking at it is super useful.
Well, and that's another point. Yeah, toss New Relic on your box. Take advantage of that 30-day trial or whatever it is. Because all of a sudden, you now have a baseline for things you should probably be looking at. And you can answer that question of, what external services does this talk to? Oh my God, it's making a call to what? Huh? Yeah, that's always my favorite. Like, I was doing something internal at Chef, and I went and looked at it and was like, you mean we only make one or two external calls here? Or none? Like, that's weird. I'm used to, how many tracking cookies can you fit on a page? How many iframes are there that reach out to different things? And sites that shall remain nameless, like, go look at the external calls that they make. When you're on websites, like, pull up the developer tools, because that's always fun, right? Or the if not the developer tools, get something like what the heck is the name of that proxy? The Charles proxy, and watch what your websites do, because it's fun.
Cool. I've never heard of that before.
Oh wow, yeah, no. Check out the Charles proxy, because as you're troubleshooting and you're trying to figure out, well, why is this call being made, or if your site has been owned and you don't understand why you just got redirected to wherever, it's kind of nice to actually catch catch things that traffic as it goes by, and be able to, like, go grep your source code to see, or go search the database for calls to that website. Not that I've ever worked for a place that's been owned.
That is cool. I just went to the site, and I had my browser open in half of my laptop screen, and it got truncated in a way that, for some reason, there was some mask over part of the site, and it just said for Windows, comma, and then blank. And I was like, oh no! But it turns out Windows, Mac, and Linux. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think it may be Java based, but it works well. There's one on Windows that's better, but I don't remember what the Windows one is.
Fiddler?
Yeah, Fiddler. Fiddler's freaking amazing. Like, I watched our web developers at Company -1 use Fiddler, and then I cried when I had to go use Charles, because Charles is awesome, but Fiddler, like, you literally do this thing where it's like, oh, I'm looking at this thing in Chrome, so I drag it over to Fiddler, and Fiddler traces what goes through it, type thing.
Wow.
Which, as a note, it's probably useful, just a pro tip with Charles, like, have a single browser that uses it instead of trying to use all of your, like, your main browser, because yeah, you end up with a ton of traffic that's not interesting to your what you're actually doing, especially with, like, single page apps. Like, the amount that you call home is kind of nuts.
So Fiddler's free, and Charles is $50. And
Yeah.
Fiddler's better than Charles?
At least that's my recollection, yes. Now, the problem with Fiddler, though, is Windows only, so...
Right. So then I have to, well, I can use my old Windows 7 license in a VM. Problem solved. Then I have an isolated debugging environment, which is even better.
Yeah, no kidding.
Or routes the browser on your normal computer through Fiddler, running in a VM, just to go back out.
Well, but then you lose the real advantage of Fiddler, right? Because, like, what makes Fiddler awesome is the clickiness, like, the workflow. As an aside to that discussion, though, one of the other things that you can look at that's free is the Zap attack proxy. I think that's what it's called. No, it's called Zap. It's the Z attack proxy. Let me go find it. Where be the links?
Looks like Fiddler has some beta builds for Mac as well.
Ooh. I'm going to have to go find
I'm
that.
using Mono, but I've never used Mono before.
Yeah, that scares me. probably.
Alpha build quite buggy. All right, so much for that.
Let's see. So I have something for you. So yes, it's the Z attack proxy from OWASP, and it does a lot of the same kind of like introspection type things, but apparently when you get good at it, you can like learn how to own your own website, and which is really useful, I think, for those of us that are on the ops side when you're trying to figure out how did that happen. So yeah. Well, awesome.
Interesting.
We've got about 4 minutes left. Were there any other topics that people wanted to hit?
Oh, can I touch back on the rollback thing again?
Yes, go for it.
There was like at least 1 or 2 times where I really remember like exactly what you were saying, where people would just, you know, the deploy was bad for some reason, and people would just run up to your desk and be like telling you like 100 different things. And I think it's good for anyone who's working on a deploy just to have that instinct to roll back, because usually it's the right answer, and if it's not the right answer, it's usually safer than leaving a bad build out in production. And there's just been so many times where there's just like 20 people by my desk saying, well, rolling back won't fix it, or rolling back, it's like, well, let's just roll back anyways. And, you know, we ended up finding out that, yeah, they were right, but we ended up rolling back like several days, and then eventually we found a build that worked, and then we fixed the bug and then rolled to the new version. And it's just like, I wish people would just get it to be instinctual to just say, hey, get it to be instinctual to just say, hey, you know, let's just roll back when something's wrong, and then let's fix it, and then roll to the new build.
Yeah, after having sat on a phone bridge from about 7 p.m. to about 3 a.m. with multiple executives on the phone, with one of them actually arguing against rolling back, as a matter of fact, no, just roll back. And here's the thing, right? Like, okay, so number one, because I can hear my coworker giving me crap about the idea of roll back versus roll forward. Yes, we are rolling forward to a previous version. I get that, because that's exactly what's happening. But with that said, I'm rolling forward to a version of code, a known version of good code. That doesn't change the fact that if there were database migrations involved, you probably need to think about it a bit more before you roll forward to that previous version. With that said, I don't know about you guys, but we generally don't change the database schema much. And when we do did database schema changes, like if you're running MySQL, that's a big deal. So you kind of plan for it. And when someone runs the MySQL, you know, the commands to actually make that change, there's people shit, because it's highly likely to blow up.
Yeah, also, I mean, a good pattern for that is getting in the habit of making your migrations out of band, right? Like making your migrations not part of your code deploys, and making your code compatible with your old database and your new database, so that you don't have to think twice about rolling back or rolling forward. It gives you a little bit of leeway, and you don't have to worry so much that 5 people have to be staring at the same machine. Maybe 2 people can stare at the same machine while you're doing your roll forward.
So, as a note, because it just dawned on me, the current episode of the Ruby Rogues is actually about this idea. In fact, I think they're calling it extreme deployment as a joke around extreme programming. But it's that idea of like, oh, just push get it out to production type things. And one of the things they talk about is, yeah, no, don't do your even if you do your migrations in your code, like they need to. Your code shouldn't rely on that migration per se. Like you should write to both places, and I think Etsy and both Etsy and Facebook have talked about this quite a bit. So, on that note, I say we wrap it for the day. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll be back again with next week. I'd love to hear suggestions for topics, because I'm usually good at figuring that out, but not always. So until next week, guys.
Thanks, guys. Also, DevOps Days Toronto is next Friday, so I might actually hook up with you guys for one of the open spaces, and we can hang out during DevOps Days.
That would not be a bad idea. Hit me up on either the Twitters or the emails or whatever. I'm CWeber on Twitter and CWeber Ops at the Googles and CWeber at GetChef.
Awesome.
Should get to me. So.
Bye, guys.